lecture 3 now of these Vonnegut lectures, and this, as you'll see from the slide, is called War Children, and it begins with atrocity. And it is very hard, sometimes when you're studying war, to assess exactly what constitutes an atrocity, since after all, the whole war itself is an atrocity, as far as people like me are concerned. And I don't believe yeah. And World War One author Robert Graves, who was a famous novelist, British novelist and poet, says, as for atrocity, well, where do you begin? The problem is not only where do you begin, but as always, where do you end? Because once you cross a line into what you consider to be an atrocity, it's like, well, are there limits to it? I mean, the word suggests no, but presumably there are some atrocities which are worse than others. And okay, so we get into these definitions of atrocity, which I think cause a needless amount of grief. But we can say about an atrocity that, speaking of needless, that it is something which causes needless pain and suffering. And so there's already been a lot of pain and suffering, then this causes more. It kills humans for no purpose. Once the battle, say, has been won, you go on well beyond completion. So, these are, that's very vague. And this sounds sort of okay, except what does completion mean? And what does the end of the battle mean? Like, when it's going to be your definition of it. When is enough enough? And, the extermination of a group or a race, which we now call ethnic cleansing, has been called ethnic cleansing, a very neat Orwellian term that is too. The thing is that people who are, as the French call them in Rwanda, génocidaires, will always have excellent reasons for their actions. Actually, they may not be such excellent reasons, but they make sense to them. That's all you need to know, basically. When you look at it, you're like, this is crackers. But it makes sense to the group who's throwing grenades or wielding machetes or whatever it is. Every death is going to be explicable, and yeah, that's kind of it. And Vonnegut tries to keep the lines simple. Dresden was a home for non-combatant civilians. It's often spoken of, it was spoken of as one of the most beautiful cities of the world, not unlike Prague and Czechoslovakia, also considered to be one of the most beautiful Gothic cities that there is. And as they're being transferred into, because remember, these men have been picked up and transported behind their lines, behind the German lines, into German cities, Dresden, which is famous for its China figures. And they're told along the way, you needn't worry about bombs, by the way. Dresden is an open city. It is undefended and contains no war industries or troop concentrations of any importance. This is on 146. So this concept of the open city, which still existed in 1944, is one of these things I was talking about in terms of total war, really. Not so much just war, although it is part of the just war narrative. An open city suggests that there are open and closed cities. Rossellini's famous cities trilogy, Rome Open City, which begins with Rome Open City, is that cities are declared open because they apparently have nothing to do with the war effort. So For instance, if somebody were going to bomb, I don't know, Canada, they would presumably target the big cities first because they are industrial hubs or because they are financial hubs. And if the city, the reasoning is if the city is taken down or wiped out and can no longer function, its stock exchange can't function, its banks can't function, and that'll cripple the war effort. That's the reasoning. Or if it's a big industrial center, and the era of cities also being in big industrial centers is pretty much over in North America mostly. Detroit used to be a major industrial center. So was New Jersey. Well, some cities in New Jersey, the state of New Jersey. New York itself was a major industrial center, certainly in the beginning of the 20th century. Chicago, and so on, right? But not anymore. I mean, mostly the cities have become, again, as I say, financial hubs and so on. So the idea of an open city is like you might think, okay, well, London could be an open city. It's like, except our London. Except no, it isn't, because we've got General Dynamics out at the airport, and we have a functioning airport. So you might say bomb the airstrip. The first thing you would do is cut off communications, bomb rail lines, stop people moving back and forth basically, and stop stuff moving back and forth. Stop things that you can use to fight the war moving back and forth. Food, material, weapons, etc. That's what material is. So London does actually not only have manufacturing, it actually has weapons manufacturing. We actually make weapons out at the airport there. Plus there's 3M, which is a big industry. And so again, it's... So during World War II, the thinking was that there could be some attempt to ameliorate the slaughter, basically, of civilians by declaring cities open or closed. If they were open, it meant that they had nothing to do with war. They were housing civilian populations, which had little or nothing to do with the production of war materials, weapons, clothing for soldiers, that kind of thing. If they were closed, it meant that they were engaged in those things. That's the idea, right? So Dresden had been declared an open city. Now, in England in 1940, I mean, this was sort of a concept that the Allies tried to encourage, but the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, famously destroyed the whole town of Coventry in a series of brutal bombing raids. And the Coventry was known to be a war manufacturing area, and so it would have been essentially declared a closed city. So that makes sense. On the other hand, when the Reich began bombing raids against London, England, and when it began attacking London, England at the very end of the war, or towards the end of the war, with the V-1 rockets. These are vengeance weapons. The V denotes vengeance in it's the German it's a translation of the German word for vengeance, which is one of those 99 syllable words. The V-1, these were essentially flying bombs, which were completely unpredictable. They were terror weapons, and they were very, very successful in that. But they didn't drive people out of London. They did drive the children out of London. There was a transport, essentially, to ship children out of London and into the rural countryside, which turned out to be not such a great thing. It was an interesting idea, and it made a lot of sense in terms of saving children's lives. It didn't make a lot of sense in terms of what happened to the children. But anyway, another whole thing. And then when the Nazis began using the V2 rockets, which essentially are early intercontinental ballistic missiles, which were limited range and so on. But they were massive flying weapons. They also targeted London. So, was London an open or a closed city? It never actually was really declared that I know of, because it was the center of the British universe, still is, in the same way that Berlin is the center, not necessarily Munich. Okay, so this has produced a huge amount of. The issue then is that there would, however, to get back to the point, there was no apparent reason to bomb a city like Dresden. The people who were working there were, as you can see by Vonnegut's novel, the factories that were there were making syrup, which was for nursing mothers or expectant mothers who were pregnant. And they were one of the problems for the Germans, for the British as well, is that there were terrible shortages. It was hard to get food and sufficient food of sufficient protein. You had to have enough caloric intake each day. So if you were a mother, an expectant mother, if you were pregnant and you were trying to feed a fetus, basically, then it could go very badly for the child, the fetus, because it would be malnourished, it might die, it might not be very intelligent. So there was a very deliberate attempt by the British and the Germans to make sure that nursing mothers and that mothers and expectant mothers got the best. They got protein. They got as many calories as the war managers could get, basically, in a day. And so the German solution to this is this very vitamin enriched syrup, which would have been given out to the malnourished mothers, who would have then nourished the babies and so on. Because remember, they didn't know how long they were going to go on fighting for. I mean, the war just sort of seemed to be going on and on. And they thought, was the war going to go on for 10 years? That's what it seemed like. I mean, in 1942 or 43, the idea that the World War II might go on until 48 was not inconceivable at all. They were like, yeah, we might take us until 48. So what happened then was that the Allies began saturation bombing campaigns, or area bombing, as it's sometimes called.